Installing the fuel pump on a 1943 Willys MB L134 engine. For the Team G503 project, I've got this Joe's Motor Pool manufactured fuel pump purchased from Ron Fitzpatrick Jeep Parts. It's a really nice unit. It's got the priming lever on the bottom. And before we get started, we're going to want to insert our brass fittings on the end for the fuel lines. They would be very difficult to turn and spin in the location that it is on the block. These 90-degree brass fittings were included with the fuel pump. I'm going to add a little bit of thread sealant here. Brass fittings are usually pretty good about not leaking, but I like to add the sealant just as an extra precaution. I'll also add a little thread sealant into the threads on the fuel pump. Just a little bit, you don't have to use a lot. Insert the fitting into the threads on the fuel pump. For the first 3 or 4 rotations of this, you'll be able to do it by hand. The machining on these is really nice and it goes on very easy. To finish tightening the fitting, I'll be using a 9/16 inch wrench. I want to show you a little something here. On the outside edge and the inside edge, it's a little bit safer and thicker to put your wrench. You don't want to ride in the middle as you might damage the actual inside of the fitting. Holding the fuel pump in your hand, simply rotate the fitting until you feel it gets snug, or as some folks may say, bottom out and get tight. Once you reach that point, you're going to want to adjust the fitting so the bottom is parallel with the base of the fuel pump, or the opening is facing away from the block. Repeat the same process with the fitting on the opposite side of the pump. As you see here, I've got my inlet and outlet fittings on and how they're oriented on the pump itself. The fuel pump gasket is part number 638737. I've got both mating surfaces both on the block and the fuel pump clean, and my next step will be to apply a coat of Permatex number 2 to both sides of the gasket. I use the Permatex number 2 both as a sealant and as well as to hold the gasket in place while I'm installing the fuel pump. It's a little difficult to orient this at first, but you want to be sure that you've got your bolt holes lined up with the gasket and the gasket is set exactly in the place it's supposed to be. I've got 2 new bolts and lock washers, and I'll apply a little sealant to the threads on the bolt. Apply a small dab of the thread sealant also on the 2 openings for the bolts on the side of the block. Carefully install the tongue of the fuel pump into the block. It's easier if you've got the cam rotated so the lobe is down. You'll still have a little tension on the spring, so once the arm is inside, you'll feel a little pressure, and all you have to do is push down gently to get your bolt holes lined up. Once the holes are lined up, you can thread in one of the bolts by hand. Snug up the bolt, but leave about 1/4 inch of the thread showing, so don't fully tighten it at this point. The bolt that rides alongside of the oil line is difficult to get in, and you'll want to be able to see where your gasket and your threads are. I'm using a 1/4 inch ratchet and extension to be able to get the bolt past the bracket on the engine. Changing the camera angle here, you can see exactly where the bolt goes through the mounting bracket on the fuel pump. I'll go ahead at this point now and tighten up the bolt that's closest to the oil line. As you tighten the bolt, it will draw the 2 mating surfaces together between the gasket. Next, tighten the bolt on the opposite side of the fuel pump. Torque the 2 bolts evenly between 12 to 17 foot-pounds. The fuel pump is now installed and ready for fuel lines. I put a couple pieces of tape over the brass fittings to protect them until I'm ready to install the lines.